Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Starting screen is there.
I think you still need to share your screen.
Oh yeah, you're right. But all the time the same shit. I'm gonna share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So with you, my screen is shared. With the folks not yet. So we welcome you very warmly to our today's meetup. We have special guests, as you might noticed already. Shawn Wildermuth is with us. We're gonna focus on that later more. And the topic of today is ASP.NET Core in Azure App Services. For today, my fellow colleague Thomas will guide you through that meetup. So it's just for me to open it, the session, and so here we go with that.
All right.
Yeah, okay, you can go up, but I have the slide deck control. It might be a bit easier if I go through the first slides and then you take it up, or is it you can just pick me and I'm gonna move next?
Just throw it over to me whenever you feel like it.
Okay, it's your stage. Feel free. There are 3 slides, and you might know them.
All right. So again, very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. You might know that we are on social media, so do follow us on Azure Dev Munich, Azure Dev Muck on Twitter. This session will also be live streamed and is available on demand on YouTube. So go to youtube.azuredev.org for that. And we usually do a recap of the meetups on azuredev.org. So you can check that out later on there as well. Next slide, please. And what we like to do at the beginning of each meetup is we like to get to know all of you a bit better. So please go to menti.com and we will give you some anonymous questions there, so we can see like what type of experience do you have with certain technologies. So please go to menti.com and enter the code 172382. I'll do that myself here as well. So that always helps us to figure out what level of detail you might expect and what we can provide you with.
Yeah, I see the numbers are growing. That's very cool.
Yeah. So first question is, how much experience do you have with Docker? And I'm seeing already there are a few newcomers here. Some people are working with it on a regular basis already. This is cool. So, but we have some people from all over the place. So most people have already tried it at least. So how many people do we have in the call? 14. So maybe we wait until we have reached 10, hopefully.
I cannot do a vote for myself.
You can't?
No, I can't. I have to use my cell phone or something like that, so.
Maybe go to the next one. The problem is in Germany we have today very beautiful weather, so most people are probably bathing somewhere if the Corona situation allows it.
Experiencing beer garden the first time this year, maybe.
Yeah, it's about time they open up again.
Yeah.
All right, let's go.
Let's go. Let's go. All the time it is.
it's great if they just change the user experience of a tool.
And look, that was the first question.
Ah, okay.
I was at the end of the of the questionnaire. What a mess.
Happens.
So you see, this is really live. We don't fake anything here. And while you're doing this, answering our questionnaire, please don't miss to subscribe to our channel and support our meetup, providing you worth content. Like,
by the way, if you don't see the new question, just refresh your browser. It should be showing you the new questions.
We should,
most developers, as expected.
we should end up with a digit of 9 here.
Yeah.
6 for now. Last 3, come on, guys.
At least no designer got lost today. That usually happens at least for 1 or 2 people.
7, here we go.
All right, that looks good. So very developer focused. That's good. That's the people we wanted to target with this meetup. Nice.
Okay, we'll move on to the next page. There, Thomas.
Yep, looks good. All right. A lot of pros wondering how to get ASP.NET into Docker.
Okay, same digit as before. I will move on, right?
Sure.
I remember, right, that Shawn has a slight tough. That's great.
Okay. Everyone knows ASP.NET, but nobody has actually put it into production in containers. So I guess the perfect crowd here today.
We should have end up with another question if they are using Azure Web Apps nowadays. Well, that was the last one. You've answered that already. That's it. Thanks a lot for your attention and answering our questions. Shawn, I hope that helps you to get a bit better picture of our audience. And yeah, Thomas, I'm out of here. Go next, please.
All right. That said, I don't think I have to add anything else, and we can hand it right over to Shawn. Thanks so much for joining us, and yeah, not much more to say from my side. Take it away.
Great.
By the way, Shawn, you're still muted.
Thank you.
Shit happens.
That makes it a lot easier. Oh, there we go. And you guys can see my slides okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can
Hi,
see
everyone.
It now. Hey, Shawn.
Thanks for... Hey. So today I wanted to talk about ASP.NET Core. I know a lot of people that I've taught over the years have used app services to deploy into production, allow scalability and to not have to host and those sorts of things. So we're going to talk about some of that and why Docker is a good option there. So first, who I am. If you don't know who I am, I'm a Pluralsight author. I have my own training company as well. And I made a film that's releasing this fall called Hello World. You can feel free to visit the link there to see more about that. And I wanted to talk about sort of where we came from. For many years, we were concerned with the actual hardware, right? If you're old enough to remember code that looked like this, you know that, the building the actual code, knowing the exact processor you were using and how much memory and those sorts of things was super important. And so we ended up with a lot of C code that looked a lot like this. And if you're as old as I am, you probably did some of this coding. And things have gotten a bit better now. Software has matured so that we don't have to worry about the hardware anymore. We can sort of let the operating system handle a lot of that for us. And I think the next step of that is sort of operating system isolation, where we're writing code today, and we don't really care about the operating system. And so that sort of comes into where Azure and AWS and a number of the different options sort of give us ideas. And we've had for a while, and a lot of people take advantage of hosting VMs inside of cloud services. We also have app services, which is really sort of code hosting, and then SaaS services, where the hoster is really handling everything for us. And I have that animation in there way too many times. And so traditionally, you write applications where you manage everything all the way down to the hardware. This is where organizations have their own data centers, and they want to manage everything and make sure that no one can get at anything. And in infrastructure as a service, you manage the operating system. This is really where we're talking about running VMs, and you're responsible for everything really over the virtualization layer. And so what we're really talking about is PaaS, where you manage just the apps and the data, and you're allowing the rest of the world to really manage, having Azure manage everything below that. And then, of course, SaaS, where the vendor's managing everything, but that's not really what we're talking about. So where this comes down to with Docker is not hit the home button, sorry. So in Docker, whereas in virtual machines, we have the infrastructure, the host operating system, and then a hypervisor where we have an OS and then our code. Docker wants to eliminate this and say, what we have instead is a container that just contains our app and any libraries we need, where the Docker engine is in essence sharing some magic operating system over it. And we as developers will know what the operating system is, but we're not going to really write against it. And ASP.NET Core does this in a pretty nice way, because the way we're developing our applications, especially in ASP.NET Core, is we're not having to think about the operating system as much. We know we can run on Mac, Linux, and Windows and not really have to be concerned with it. So the magic of really what Docker is giving us, if you haven't worked with it before, it actually seems like virtualization made up in the minds of developers, because developers always like to think of, or at least object-oriented developers like to think of reuse and inheritance, and that's kind of the way Docker thinks about these things. So Docker starts in the case of some image that contains an operating system. In this case, it's Ubuntu, or however I'm supposed to pronounce that. And then I'm going to add core to that, and then I have a new container that is inherited from it. And then another one that also has maybe SQL Server or SQLite in it that I'm inheriting from it. And then I'll create my own container that simply has my app in it, and then I'm pointing it at this container that already has all of my installation needs handled for me. And so that's what we're going to see today, is that we're just going to create a container that uses another of these images and just contains the things that I care about. I don't have to think about installers and how we're going to host it and making copies of system images and handling updates and all of that sort of thing. I'm just having to care about my my code. So enough with slides, because I'm not a big fan of slides. Let's start with sort of .NET Core in Docker. So I have an ASP.NET Core project here. It's a really simple one. It's just an API that returns some information from configuration, right? It's not brilliant. just so you know that, and you're going to trust me that it works. I have some data that it's returning, and you can see the JSON version of it. And right now I'm sort of testing it in IS Express, though I could run it directly from the command line and the same thing would sort of work. Typical, obviously your projects would be bigger. And I've installed something called Docker Desktop. This is available on Mac and PC. And let's see if this will open quickly at all. It is a free tool you can install. It essentially it's allowing you to run Docker images locally in a pretty seamless way. This is sort of the developer version of Docker. And so most of what I'm going to show you here on the machine is going to be powered by Docker Desktop. I'll have a link to that later on in the presentation. And so the first thing that I want to do when I'm thinking about using Docker is or using Docker in app services is I need to get and create images on my own machine. But this also means that I'm going to want to be able to develop and debug using Docker. Now, I don't always use Docker as my day-to-day way of running the application because it can be a little heavier than just running IS Express or whatever. But at the ultimately, what we want to do is be able to have that same environment that I'm going to deploy to Azure runnable here. And this is one of the benefits of Docker that I really like is that I'm running the actual image instead of just passing it my code like I would with app services and hoping that everything in the way that they put together that code is correctly. I'm actually saying that this is the binary package that I want you to execute, and that binary package happens to be an image that's going to sit in app services. So let's see what that looks like. In Visual Studio, this becomes pretty easy in that I can right-click a project and say Docker support. I can just add Docker support to a project. And what this will do is add a Docker script to build an image for me. And let's see what that looks like. In most cases, I'm going to target Linux as the operating system because the Docker images are smaller. You may have some Windows-specific things and want to target Windows as an image, but Linux is really where it's at when it comes to Docker containers. And if we look at this file, this is the script that's really building to create our project. And I'm not going to walk through this too much, but I'm going to point out a couple of things. First, we're using a pre-built image that already has ASP.NET 3.1 pre-installed on it. These are built by Microsoft as sort of these really thin versions of a Linux image that can run ASP.NET. And then it actually creates a couple of images because of the way it's doing it for development, but we end up with this as all the data in the final image. This is basically the same as our first image, except our project is copying from a published directory because it's published our application into the Docker image, and then it's saying, please run .NET with our project. That's all it's doing. And you'll see here that it's changed the debugging environment to Docker. And so this is one of the places where it can get a little bogged down the first time it runs a new image, but hopefully it won't take too long. There we go. And so this is literally running it on my desktop, but pointing it at a Docker image. Now, how do I know that? How do I know it's actually running Docker? If we open up a console, we do Docker PS, which is a command to show all of the running Docker containers, we'll see this Dockerized core is running on an image called dockerizedcore.deb. So this is actually running inside. And essentially what it's doing is pointing my machine's 32768 port to its internal port of 443 because we're using SSL, or you can see it's also using 80 back here. And so that when I am running this code, it looks like I'm running on my local host, but Docker's actually listening at this magic port and forwarding it to this Docker image. And so this means that, you know, when I run this, well, I can do the same sort of debugging and know that it's going to work. What happens a lot in app services, I find, is I'll deploy it up and that there'd be something that I'm unexpecting. Maybe some of the files didn't get uploaded the way they were supposed to. Maybe I didn't have them set as part of the publish package. Like there's a bunch of things that can go wrong, especially if I'm deploying into Linux Docker. You can also have name casing be different because on Windows, obviously, the operating system isn't case sensitive, and on Linux it is. And so this really is going to be the vision of what it actually looks like in Azure. And so once I'm ready to do this, there's a couple of pieces. Let me go over to the Azure website for a minute. And one of the things you're going to want to think about is something called a registry. Now, Docker has its own registry, and this is basically a warehouse of these images. Azure also has their own, which aren't as public, and that's what we're going to actually use. And so I have a registry here called WM Containers. My company name is Wildermuth, so that shouldn't be a big surprise. And I have a number of containers that are listed here, and I always forget where the repository is. And we can see that I have a couple of in production containers here. These are just a list, and let me go to like the Hello World film one. And we can see that I just have one container listed with a tag called latest. This is basically saying that I can test different versions of this image, and then ultimately I'm going to deploy to live the one that's called latest. And that latest tag is a common metaphor, is a common best practice with Docker. So you're going to see that quite a lot. And so what I want to do is actually get our new image in here. This won't deploy it to the web in App Services yet, but it will give it a place that App Services can pull from. So how do we do this? We can actually do this by using Publish in Visual Studio, though there are ways to do it from the command line as well, but I'm not going to give him control. I'm going to publish to, you can do Azure or Docker and obviously some of the others. I'm going to actually publish directly to a container registry. And the Azure one, and it's going to know all my credentials, thankfully. And so I'm going to look for that WM containers. And we can see that I'm telling it that I'm going to post it as a latest image, and that we're going to use the project name for the image name. And this is effectively going to take the directions that I have in that Docker file, generate a Docker image, and then upload that Docker image. Now, the Docker image isn't an entire machine. What it's actually doing is pushing up just the data that is in my difference from the one I'm inheriting from. And so you can see these are actually the different stages of the parts of Docker. But really, this last piece, 72 megs, is the size of my application. So now that it's up there, let's go back to Azure, and let's create a new app service. Oh, no, that's not what I want. I'm in the wrong place. I don't want a new dashboard. I want a new resource. So here, just like you've probably done before if you've worked with app services, is I'm just going to say app service to make sure. Did they rename it to web app again? Yep. And so I'm going to create a new web app. And there you can see my subscription name. And I'm going to go ahead and pick that same WM resources resource group. You could create a new one if you want. And now I'm going to give it a name, and I'll call it Munich Docker. Oh, good, it wasn't used. You never know. And instead of publishing code, I'm going to actually publish the Docker container and choose Linux, because that's what I did for my operating system. And I already have a plan set up. And so I'm going to review and create this. I'm happy with everything there, and so I'll go ahead and create this. And we'll see that the deployment is underway. This will take a minute or two to actually be ready. And this is the part that I'm always worried that we'll run out of time for. Why this is running, let me show you a couple of slides that I wanted to cover in here anyway. So we all know about app services. I just want to sort of cover some of this. This is just the idea that just to run your code, and this could be ASP.NET, this could be ASP.NET Core, this could be Java, etc., PHP. And the idea is to just deliver your code to it, and it runs it effectively inside a giant nest of IIS servers. It's simpler than renting a VM or a machine, but it is this where you're sitting inside of IIS effectively, which has some limitations. I have found that as I've used them, that these app services can degrade over time. As I do more and more deployments, because it isn't a perfectly clean environment when I redeploy my code, sometimes I've had problems where I've had to literally destroy the app service and create a brand new one in order to get sort of that cleanness. This integration with Git can cause some bloat in the sizes of the app services as well. And so the idea of using Docker in it, for me, has really improved reliability, mostly because what I'm delivering is what I'm testing against. It's really the same literal binaries that are being tested. It isn't getting it from Docker and then building it inside of app services. I found that the cost can be lowered as well because the utilization on the Linux container seems to be lower than it is typically in IIS. So using less CPU, throughput is pretty much the same. And because Docker, unless you configure it to store your state somewhere, it forces me to stop relying on state. And so I'm storing data in SQL Azure, in blob storage, in other places where my state is very specific. I'm not relying on the file system much anymore. And Docker sort of implies that, because every time you redeploy, you're redeploying this pristine image that doesn't have any of the state you used to have. And so it forces me to stop relying on file system state, which for scalability is going to help you if you end up needing to scale this out to a lot of things. So our deployment is complete. Let's go back to our dashboard and go to our Unix container. And this is essentially the same as what we would get in a normal app service. The real difference here is container settings, right? This will show you sort of what your containers are. And I come to this container setting specifically because there's this option that isn't turned on until you actually go in the first time, and that's continuous deployment. What that means, and you may or may not want it, but what that means is that I hope I picked the right one, because that says NGINX. Maybe I picked the wrong container. Unix Docker. That is weird. Maybe I never changed this. I'm glad I didn't try to show it. But let's go back to the, I'm using, this is my image. Continuous deployment says every time I push a new image to this, to the registry, that it's going to go ahead and redeploy it. And so let's save this real quick. And let's see if we can go to the actual site. Go clockwise sometimes makes Docker go faster. Because we just changed the image, it might be taking a minute to load up. I'm going to show you an example of one more piece. So let's see, this is going to catch up. Normally would not take nearly this long if I put the right container settings in. So again, since we have a minute while it's catching up, just make sure you're picking the actual container you want, and this should be much faster. Should never. Using Azure for a demo is like acting with children and animals. You never know what is going to happen for you. I'm going to actually restart the image just in case, because sometimes that will solve this can't be found issue. Oh, actually 404 is exactly what it is, because there's no root website. So API, what did I call it? Sorry about this, I forgot what I called the path. That's not helpful at all. There it is, API who's. And so we can see we're now getting, as expected, the exact same name as we had before. But one of the things you'll notice is when we ran it in from our Docker container, let's do that again. It's because it has a new certificate, accept the risk. We were getting this name development server. And the reason we got that is in our app settings, and notice I'm looking at the app settings development version, I have the server name specified here. Now this, because this was deployed, it didn't get that information, and I don't have that in my main one because I'm expecting it to be defined when I deploy. So let's talk about how that happens. Go back to Azure, just like you might have done with pure app services. Any settings you set up here in the settings are then forwarded to the container. Now you could have done this actually in setting up the container, but because you might want different kinds of machines, it also lets you do it here. So I'm going to make a new application setting, and I'm going to call it server. And because colons aren't allowed on Linux, we actually have to do double underscore and then name, and I'll call this inside a container. I'll save that and make sure that I save those change in settings. And by doing that, it will restart the application, though the restart should be pretty quick. And where we had null earlier, we should see once it's actually restarted it, because I think we're getting a lot of cache here. No server name. There we go. Ended the cache. We're now seeing inside the container. So it's now still pulling from the configuration that we had configured here. And that's going to be one of those things that you may have a handful of these that you're going to need to specify. You know, you can imagine connection strings are a common one to point at SQL Azure instead of your local SQL Server as an example of that. The last thing I wanted to cover is sort of the automation of it. So one of the things that I had normally been getting from app services was this ability to check in my code and have it deploy the container. And so this is a public example out on GitHub This is actually my blog, Wilder blog, Shawn Wildermuth Wilder blog on GitHub. And this is all the code that I run my own blog site with. And if we go to actions, which is where the sort of the magic happens, actions is where I can see. I'm actually going to reduce the, yeah, so we can see this a little better. Actions are scripts that I've specified in GitHub to do once I build the project, and that is usually, to build it, to test for, to run tests, those sorts of things, but also have this deployment in here. And you could use, there's a number of different ways. You can actually do this in Azure, you can do this in a third party. Because I'm using GitHub, I'm going ahead and using their actions. And so let's edit this, which is always confusing to me where we edit the script. This script is actually part of the code base. So if you look at GitHub workflows, this is something that it'll build for you. And if this is a little overwhelming or confusing, I have a blog post that walks through this one at a time, but it's basically a YAML file that says every time I push with a tag of my code with a version number tagged to it, and this is the way I sort of tell it that I'm ready for release, I actually say, go ahead and run the build. And what I'm doing here is setting up .NET Core. So I'm using an action inside the build environment here to set up .NET Core. I'm logging into Azure Docker, and I'm doing this because I'm going to need to create a new container or upload a new container to the container registry. And then here I'm actually going to run Docker build to go ahead and build that same image that I was doing inside Visual Studio. This is essentially the command line version of what that does. So just go ahead and create it. Here's the Docker file that describes it. This is where how I want you to tag it, and then I actually push it up to that registry. And so all this is doing is basically building the container based on my code. And then because I'm posting this with latest, Azure then, because if you remember our container settings where continuous deployment, every time this latest tag gets updated with a new image, it automatically deploys for us. Whoops, automatic deploys. And so this is a way to sort of automate that when I, in the code here, make a new post and then add to a tag of with a version number, which is basically what I do. We can see that there's 32 tags here, and they are pretty much for version numbers of my website. Last time I did that was about 27 days ago when I had a little bug to fix. And because it saw V as the beginning of the tag, it ran that code, container got created, our continuous deployment pulled the new container, redeployed our application, and then it magically became a website. So let's see if we have any questions. I'm going to go to the discussion tab, or you can unmute yourself and we'll do it that way. Oh, there it is. Oh, no, that's not chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat or unmute yourself, and we'll go from there. Any questions?
Yeah, hi, Stan. I have a question. We are creating the Docker image, and that is for the Linux container, right? So if I create the Docker image and I can run on the Linux containers, right?
Yes.
So there are two types of hosting of the .NET Core, right? One is in process, something is right, and out of process hosting model. So by default, it is having the in process hosting model. But so if I run in a Linux container, how does it works?
Okay, the way it works is, oh wow, my light just went out. Let's go back to Visual Studio. So here's my project, and in Linux, I'm just going to open up a console. It basically just runs .NET Core. Now, one of the things about .NET Core, if you're not that familiar with it, is it's essentially a console app. So if I do ASP.NET Run, which is effectively what it's doing inside the Linux container, is it runs this and is now listening. And in this case, it's actually in port 5000 or 5001, one's for HTTP and one's for HTTP. And so in the Linux container, just running this console app that happens to be listening for web requests. So in that way, you don't need IIS, you don't need Apache. It is its own web server, and which is why it's so light, right? Because there's not a lot to it. I'm going to make the assumption maybe you haven't seen this part of ASP.NET Core, but the magic, to me, one of the magic moments I had with the ASP.NET Core is when I saw this void main, which if you've done ASP.NET and you've only lived inside of IIS, you know that the way that the startup happens is somewhat convoluted in order to fit into IIS. And the way that ASP.NET Core gets around this is saying, this is just a console app, right? I'm just going to run this at the console, and I'm going to listen for requests. And before it being hosted on IIS, it actually runs this console app and then just redirects the input and the output through IIS in sort of a thin layer. So I hope that explains how it works.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Because I could not have been completely clear, and please don't be afraid if English isn't your first language. German, all I know of German is Guten Tag, and I used to know a little phrase when I was busking in Cologne that I would say to the audiences, but I don't remember it anymore. That was 30 years ago.
Nice one. Yeah, come on, folks. If you have any more questions? I didn't see a Docker file anywhere. Isn't there any? One question.
Sure. When I added Docker, can you still see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good. When I added Docker to the project file, that actually, what I had done, just to make sure you can see that, is I did add Docker support. And when I did that, it actually created a Docker file inside my project. So there is, in fact, a Docker file. In reality, for production, this isn't the Docker file you want to use. This is actually a little more complicated. You actually see this link to fast container mode. I usually create a Docker. I can't remember what it's called now. It's not the Docker file. It's the new format for Docker files of the actual production of what I'm doing, because it simplifies some of these things. But I'll use this Docker container often if it's a simple project. Like Hello World is a super simple website, and so the speed and even the size of the Docker container I'm not that concerned with. But this will make a little bit more of a bloated version of your Docker container, but not huge, certainly. You can save a few bytes if you customize it.
Cool. Björn says, thanks for answering the question. There it is. A surprising.
And I'll have a copy of this project as well as the slides up on my website tomorrow. So let me show you some of the links while people are still thinking of questions.
Thomas, go ahead with your mentioning.
I just had one question in regards to the regular web apps. Is there any pro to choosing a regular web app over the Dockerized the container version, or would you go for the container, straight to the container version for every project?
It's hard to say. Introducing Docker introduces complexity. It certainly does. There's no getting around that. And so I usually tell people, if they're using app services, that if what they're doing is pretty simple, or they're doing a bunch of sort of using it for testing or using it for prototyping, just going the app service route. One of the reasons I like the Docker solution here with app services is if you get successful, like if what you're building then needs 100,000, you could always move over to the actual Docker hosting, which is where you get a lot more control over orchestration and such. That is in Azure. So there is a confusion that there's a couple of different ways to host Docker in Azure. And what we've shown with app services, let me see if I can find my browser. What we've shown in app services here is actually inside of apps, inside of app server or web apps, depending on which one they're calling it these days. The other option is actually, let's go to add real quick, is container
instance.
And that's much more expensive, but it also is guaranteeing the level of orchestration, performance, and some other things. And so I like the Docker version because I can always take this small thing that may or may not need a lot of resources. I can do some scaling in app services, but there's sort of there's a ceiling there, and if I need to, I can always move it over to the actual Docker hosting, which is more expensive, but when you're successful, that cost shouldn't be a big deal. So instead of having to then embrace it in order to quickly move it over to the full Docker hosting, that's one of the reasons I like to choose Docker in most cases. And because of the problem I'm having I've had with app services and sort of the image getting dirty after too many deployments. This is another reason. And let me show you one other project real quick. Let's see if I can pull it up quickly. Of course, it's not just sitting there. I'll show you it in GitHub. It's probably easier. I'm going to find out the secret. So when I did Hello World Film, which is pretty much just a website that shows HTML, I'm actually not even using ASP.NET. And I chose Docker there because this is the entire Docker image, right? I'm just serving plain HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and I'm using this super thin Nginx image in order to do it. And so sometimes for something simple, I won't even use ASP.NET. I will just, because this is the whole website. There's no server-side manipulation or anything, and so being able to use different kinds of images really can help.
Okay, there's one last question, one more question from Summer. I do not have any more names for you. She or he is saying, thank you for the talk. What is necessary for production operation?
What I showed you is pushing it straight into production. One of the interesting things about, sort of if you want to have, let's say a beta or a testing server, is you can use tags to do that. So you can imagine that in my container, when I published it here, I go to publish, which you could do at the command line, and I usually do, is I can change what tag I'm going to use. So I might have okay, we're going to push it out to our beta customers, or I could push it out to our test team, and you could have different versions of that one image that go to A/B testing or test servers and those sorts of things. And so the tag lets you do that sort of having a production version, which is usually latest, and then having other tags to help you along the process of doing smoke builds and everything else you might want to do. And so the only difference with the website we just created and a production website is really pointing away from pointing to your own domain or subdomain, right? Obviously, you're not going to deploy something to mywebApp.azurewebservices.net. That's probably not a good idea. But if it's an internal project, there's no reason not to. There's no reason not to. I hope that answered your question, Andreas.
Summer, you have to.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's there he is. Let's there it is.
If
okay.
I change the tag, is this also the necessary change the repository?
Well, you're pushing to the repository, so let me pull up Azure again, just so I can see if I can explain this the best I can. Resources. And so when we look at the repositories here, and we see that there's my Dockerized core. This is a repository of not just this image. This isn't an image. This is the category for the image. And so you might have one or more images here with different tags for different steps in the process. Because we only have deployed it once, we only have this sort of latest tag. But in this case, you could have multiple images of different stages in the process. So you might, as you do development, have a dev tag that you're constantly updating every time the code changes. And then you might have a testing tag that once you do an internal test, you then push it with that tag that goes to a different Docker website. And then, of
Okay.
course, your public website, you would only push latest to.
Okay. And the endpoint of the website?
Well, the endpoint of the website is the Azure actual website, is the app service. So here, if we look at, what did I call it, Munich? So with Munich Docker here, right now, this is only pointing at the endpoint that we specified. Now, obviously, you don't, like I said, you don't want to go with the Munich Docker Azure websites. That's where you would change that endpoint by adding a custom domain to point at it.
I see. But if I have one last group and one dev group,
you would need two app services, or the other option always is, let me go. Nope. Well, yeah, let's get rid of that. This is what I'm looking for. You can also do, where is it?
With deployment.
Yeah, with deployment slots.
Yes.
And in this way, you can have, depending on your process, you could have several slots which have different endpoints that point at different images. And the benefit of that is, if you have a deployment slot for, let's say, a beta version that you have a bunch of your testers hit as sort of the last step before you go to production, when you go to production, you can actually swap those slots so that it just takes what you actually tested instead of redeployment, what you actually tested, and just switch the endpoint so that you then are on live once you've sort of blessed that version that you're about to release is a released version. I hope that answers that question.
I see.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Shawn, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
All right. So one is, if I use app service for each app, I would be getting a cost. But using Docker in Kubernetes, won't it save cost for multiple apps?
It could. Kubernetes hosting in Azure isn't cheap. And so the pricing for app services is a lot cheaper than the Docker or the Kubernetes hosting on a whole. But if you had 20 or 30 of these inside of a Kubernetes cluster, yes. And you also gain the benefit of, obviously, Kubernetes is going to allow you to do auto scaling, some of the other things for orchestration that you'd want to be. But setting up Kubernetes isn't trivial. I would think that especially during development, app services is a great way to start that. And it really depends on how complicated what you're doing. If you're building a microservice, right, a microservices architecture, you'd want to use Kubernetes because that helps do a lot of the sort of naming convention and knowing what's in the front and what's the word I'm looking for? And handling load balancing. Like it gives you a lot of things. I would not try to do a microservice by deploying 7 things in app service, right? That just doesn't make sense. But for these sort of atomic projects, I find app services to be a great solution. And again, I'm using it for a lot of small projects, not one giant project. If your whole organization, was a customer-facing organization and you needed to deal with scale up and down a lot, I probably wouldn't go with app services in any case, but still use Docker. Hope that answers your question.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you can also like put multiple web apps into one app service plan, right? To save
Yes,
cost.
absolutely. Yeah. So like the one I added today is part of an existing app service plan that I've already set up. So when you go and set this up for the first time, you may need to add a new app service plan and add a new resource group. Like there's several levels of sort of grouping inside of Azure you'd have to get comfortable with.
Yeah, comparing that with AKS, you have to set up virtual machines and all that stuff, and behind you have to manage the certificates. And there is a lot more, let's say, management in IT stuff than using scalable web apps for that. So
Absolutely.
it has somehow a pain point where you would move to AKS, but it's not always like that's the one and only thing to go, I would say.
I would agree with you there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Imaginary scaling issues, yeah.
What about AKS? It's always scalable. Yes, if the VM is still maintainable and doing that stuff and providing processor time and storage, it can scale up. If not, you have to set up a VM, put it into your cluster, and so on. By the way, if you put your apps into a single app plan, you have to respect that there are limits to the dedicated app plan. So it has to do with the sizing or pricing you selected, that there are availabilities of storage, processor time, and RAM. Please consider that also if you're using a single app plan for your multi-web web app.
Yeah, there is a limitation. Like I have 3 app plans for different levels of performance. Like I have one that's basically at the free level because I have a bunch of things I create and destroy, as I need them. But then I have an expensive plan for my blog because it gets a decent amount of traffic, and I don't want to limit the performance of that based on the app plan.
Yes, that's cool.
So I'm at my hard stop, unfortunately. I appreciate everyone for coming. Again, go to wildermuth.com, and when I have the blog post about this talk, feel free to ask any questions that came up later or you didn't want to ask in front of everybody else. Just use the comments there, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure having you. And where can people find you? Maybe on Twitter?
I'm Shawn Wildermuth everywhere. So ShawnWildermuth, or just go to wildermuth.com or search for me on the internet. I'm everywhere, but I use that same moniker everywhere. It's at Shawn Wildermuth on Twitter and GitHub and everything.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great.
And enjoy the rest of your day. I think you're still early in the day, right?
Yeah, it's still it's just 1 o'clock here now. So.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Guten Tag.
Good day. So if you didn't recognize it yet, that was a live stream from US to Germany to you folks, and we're very thankful for having Shawn with us here. So Thomas, what's up?
Not much. I think we're about done. Thanks everyone for joining, for tuning in today. I guess we still owe you the topic for next month. We're still in the process of figuring this out. Hopefully next time the weather won't be that good. But yeah, unless there's anything else you want to add, Ralph, for today?
No, not that much. We can give a brief outlook on whom's going to join us in the future. It looks like that Sarah Leon will join us for a talk. So we're looking forward to make that true. And yeah, we'll have some surprises for you. Just a short hint and note about getting in-person meetups back again. It looks like we can start with that to the end of the year. So for now, it's allowed to have 50 people within a room for a single event. but you have to respect and maintain the space between. So that's 1.5 meters for now in each direction. And you can think by yourself that's a really big room you have to provide for. And we cannot guarantee that people are not getting infected somehow there. Look at Tönnies at Gütersloh, which happens for now. So respect yourself, stay safe. Social distancing is not funny, but necessary nowadays. And we hope you are all okay. During that time, enjoy everything you can get outside. Maybe you go out and have a nice trip within Europe. I've done so far. It's pretty interesting. And yeah, stay safe. And we want to have you next time here. Please don't forget to subscribe, not to Twitter, nor to YouTube. So you are supporting us with that very much. Thomas, was that the end?
That was, I guess, the end. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. And yeah, stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe. Cheers.